What unfolds when a group of men target a black woman under the false belief that no one will intervene? This is the astonishing narrative of a resilient woman and her fiercely devoted dog who confronted prejudice head-on. From a harrowing street encounter to an intense courtroom finale, witness a journey of courage and justice as strength emerges from the underestimated. Prepare to be captivated as this story reveals its twists and turns. The golden rays of a late afternoon sun streamed through the majestic oak trees lining a tranquil suburban road. Eleanor Davis, a dignified woman in her late 60s, adjusted her wide-brimmed sun hat. The modest silver locket resting on her chest gleamed softly as her hand tightened on Duke's leash. Duke, her loyal Rottweiler, moved with a confident gait beside her, his glossy black and tan coat shimmering under the sun's light. This walk was a comforting ritual, a cherished moment of peace in a neighborhood that had been her home for over 4 decades. Eleanor's community was a mix of charm and complexity. While the town exuded suburban warmth, subtle undertones of division lingered. She had faced these silent judgments before, the stares, the whispered remarks. Still, Eleanor carried herself with quiet pride. Her necklace and bracelet were not just adornments, but tangible memories of her late husband, Samuel. They represented a life built with love, respect, and perseverance. She wore them like armor, a testament to the journey she and Samuel had shared. "Ready, boy?" Eleanor asked softly. Duke wagged his tail in response, his alert eyes scanning their surroundings. The pair strode past manicured lawns and picket fences, nodding politely to occasional passers-by. Eleanor felt the weight of lingering gazes, but pushed the thoughts aside, savoring the serenity of the moment. As they turned onto Maple Avenue, an unsettling noise broke the peace. The low rumble of a pickup truck engine grew louder, and Duke's posture changed instantly. His ears twitched, his body tensing as a silent warning. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder and saw the truck idling suspiciously a few houses down. The truck's windows rolled down, revealing 4 men in their 20s. Their faces bore a mix of mockery and menace, their laughter slicing through the quiet street. "Nice dog," one of them called out with a smirk, his tone dripping with ridicule. Eleanor kept walking, gripping Duke's leash more firmly. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. The truck screeched to a halt, and the men stepped out, their movements deliberate and intimidating. "Afternoon, ma'am," the tallest one greeted, his smile sharp and cold. The others stood close behind, their postures radiating hostility. One of them pointed at Eleanor's locket. "Pretty little necklace you got there," he sneered, his eyes glinting with greed. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, but her expression remained calm. "It is a beautiful day, isn't it?" she replied, her tone measured and firm. Duke stepped closer, his growl deepening, a sound that carried both warning and readiness. The men exchanged glances and laughed, their mockery filling the air. "Where you headed, ma'am?" "In such a hurry?" another one taunted, stepping into her path. Eleanor stopped, her grip on Duke's leash tightening as she stared the man down. "Just taking a walk," she said evenly, her voice unwavering despite the chill creeping up her spine. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the street like ominous markers of the confrontation. The tallest man leaned in, his smirk widening. "We're just admiring, that's all," he said, his gaze lingering on the necklace. "No harm in appreciating nice things, is there?" "Admire it from afar," Eleanor shot back, taking a deliberate step forward. Duke moved with her, his growl now a low, rumbling threat. The man didn't budge. "Feisty for an old lady, aren't you?" he jeered, folding his arms. "What are you afraid of? Us or your mutt here losing his nerve?" Duke responded with a sharp, commanding bark that echoed through the street. The sudden sound made the men flinch, a brief crack in their bravado. Eleanor didn't need to glance at Duke to know he was ready to protect her at any cost. "You should listen to him," she said firmly, her voice steady and sharp. "He's got more sense than any of you." Another man scoffed, his face twisting with anger as he stepped closer. "Look, we're not here to hurt you, unless you make us," he hissed. Just hand over the necklace, maybe that bracelet too, and we'll leave you be." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her resolve hardening. "What makes you think you can rob me and walk away?" she asked coldly, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. "Because no one cares," another one spat, his words venomous. "You're just some old black lady. Who's gonna care what happens to you?" Eleanor's heart pounded, but her expression didn't falter. She knew their words came from a place of hatred and ignorance, but she refused to let their poison seep into her spirit. "You've made a mistake coming after me," she declared, her tone unyielding. "And if you don't leave now, you'll regret it." The tallest man laughed harshly. "Regret it? Lady, you've got no idea who you're dealing with. Just hand over the goods, and this doesn't have to get ugly." Duke barked again, louder and fiercer, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to unleash. The men shifted uneasily, their confidence wavering for a moment as the dog's protective instincts came to the forefront. "You think your dog can scare us?" one of them sneered, trying to mask his unease. "He's just a dumb mutt." Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze locking onto the man's. "Try me," she said, her voice a cold, unwavering challenge. "I promise you, he's not bluffing." The tension thickened, the line between predator and prey blurred as the men began to realize the gravity of their mistake. Eleanor and Duke stood firm, their bond an unbreakable shield against the hatred before them. What happens when hate crosses paths with bravery? The story unfolds as a fiercely determined black woman and her devoted canine partner confront prejudice head-on, turning a terrifying encounter into a triumph of courage and resolve. With every tense moment, this tale draws you into a battle of willpower and justice. Let's delve into this extraordinary narrative. The tension in the quiet street was palpable as Duke's growls resonated, their reverberations bouncing off the surrounding houses like an ominous warning. For a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered in the eyes of the men, but the red-faced man dismissed it with a shake of his head, rallying his companions with a sneer. "She's bluffing," he spat. "Let's grab what we came for." The tallest man nodded, stepping forward with a smug confidence that suggested he believed himself untouchable. "Fine," he muttered darkly. "If you won't hand it over, we'll take it the hard way." The four men began to spread out, forming a loose circle around Eleanor. She instinctively stepped back, keeping Duke close, her heart pounding like a war drum, yet her voice remained steady, a pillar of defiance. "You're making a mistake," Eleanor warned, her eyes locking onto the tallest man's. Her words carried a steel edge, unwavering against the growing threat. "Walk away now while you still can." The tallest man smirked, dismissing her words as empty bravado. "Big talk for someone with no backup," he jeered. His tone dripped with mockery, but Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Who says I'm alone?" she countered, her eyes darting briefly to a neighbor's security camera mounted on a nearby garage. She didn't know if it was recording, but the gesture was deliberate, a subtle hint that their actions might not go unnoticed. The men followed her gaze, but their skepticism remained unshaken. "Yeah, sure," one of them scoffed, rolling his eyes. "No one's coming to help you." His confidence was short-lived. One of the men lunged forward, testing Duke's resolve. The Rottweiler responded with a ferocious bark, his jaws snapping mere inches from the attacker's outstretched hand. The man stumbled back, cursing under his breath. "Damn dog," he growled, cradling his arm. "It's not worth it," another muttered, glancing nervously at Duke, whose growls had deepened into a menacing rumble. "It is worth it," the tallest man snapped, his temper flaring. "She's bluffing. That mutt can't take all of us." Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a blade. "He won't have to," she said coolly, her words laced with a calm fury. The red-faced man, spurred by frustration and wounded pride, lunged again. This time, Duke sprang into action with the precision of a coiled spring unleashed. His powerful jaws latched onto the man's sleeve, yanking him off balance and sending him sprawling onto the pavement. "Get him off me!" the man screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he thrashed against Duke's unyielding grip. One of the others shouted, "Call him off!" Their earlier bravado crumbled, replaced by visible fear. Eleanor stood firm, her grip on Duke's leash steady. "I warned you," she said evenly, her tone devoid of sympathy. "This is your doing." The tallest man barked an order, motioning for the others to assist. But the fear in their eyes betrayed them. None dared approach. Duke released the red-faced man with a calculated precision, positioning himself as a guard over his fallen prey. His hackles bristled, his bared teeth gleaming in the fading sunlight. "Come on," one of the men urged, his voice shaky. "We've got numbers. It's just a dog." "Just a dog?" Eleanor's voice was sharp, slicing through their feeble posturing. "He's more loyal and capable than any of you." Another man attempted to grab Duke's leash, but the Rottweiler was faster, spinning on his haunches and snapping dangerously close to the man's hand. The would-be attacker recoiled, stumbling backward into his companions. "You're pathetic," Eleanor declared, her words striking like a whip. "4 grown men, and you can't even handle an old lady and her dog." The tallest man's face contorted with rage. His temper snapped, and he lunged directly at Eleanor, his hand reaching for the chain around her neck. Duke moved like a flash of lightning, clamping down on the man's jacket and shaking him violently. "Stop! Get him off!" the man screamed, his bravado shattered. His companions hesitated, torn between aiding him and fleeing the scene. The red-faced man, still clutching his injured arm, snarled from the ground. "She's not worth this. Let's just go." "No!" the tallest man spat, defiant but clearly desperate. "Not until we get what we came for." Eleanor's voice was calm, but carried a cutting authority. "Leave now," she commanded, "and maybe you'll walk away with what little dignity you have left." "You're not in control," another man sneered, though his voice trembled. "We're not scared of you." "Then why are you still standing there?" Eleanor challenged, her tone icy. "You had every chance to walk away, and you chose this." The tallest man finally shoved Duke off and staggered back, his face flushed with fury and humiliation. "We're not leaving empty-handed," he snarled, spitting onto the pavement. Duke barked again, advancing with a predatory grace that made the men falter. The red-faced man scrambled to his feet, his injured arm hanging limp. "This is a waste of time," one muttered, his voice barely audible. "What happens when courage and loyalty collide with desperation and fear?" Eleanor Davis and her steadfast companion Duke delivered an unrelenting lesson in resilience, and as the chaos unraveled, justice drew closer. Let's delve into the climactic moments of this intense confrontation. The air was thick with tension as Eleanor stood her ground, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Actually, you are done," she declared, her voice slicing through the growing panic like a blade. She stepped forward with deliberate calm, Duke pacing beside her, both exuding a formidable presence that seemed to shrink the men's bravado. "Last warning," she said, her tone sharp and resolute. "Leave now, or next time, I won't call Duke off." The group faltered, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty. Their gazes darted nervously between the ferocious dog and the unflinching woman. The seconds stretched, each one laden with hesitation, but the tallest man's pride held him captive. He squared his shoulders and spat venomously. "We're not letting her win." His companions exchanged uneasy glances. The red-faced man muttered, "Let's just go. This isn't worth it." "She's bluffing," the leader snapped, stepping closer. "She can't control that dog forever." Before anyone could react, the tallest man lunged for Eleanor's necklace. The sudden motion shattered the fragile tension, igniting chaos. Duke surged forward with unparalleled power, breaking free from Eleanor's grip. The dog's massive body collided with the man, sending him crashing to the ground with a resounding thud. Pinned beneath Duke's muscular frame, the man screamed in panic as the dog's teeth bared inches from his face. "Help me!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The other men hesitated, their courage crumbling as they watched their leader flail helplessly. One of them took a step forward, but Duke's menacing growl and snapping jaws froze him in place. Eleanor's voice rang out, cold and cutting. "Not so brave now, are you?" she asked, her words heavy with disdain. "Shut up!" one of the others yelled, but his voice was hollow, lacking conviction. Then a new sound emerged, a distant, rising wail. Sirens. The unmistakable approach of law enforcement sent ripples of panic through the group. One of the men cursed loudly. "Cops! We have to go! Not without him!" Another protested, pointing at the man pinned beneath Duke. But fear had already taken root. The red-faced man staggered backward, clutching his injured arm. "Screw this," he muttered. "I'm not going to jail." He bolted toward the truck, the others following in his wake. "Wait! Don't leave me!" the leader screamed, his voice cracking with terror. But his cries fell on deaf ears as the truck roared to life and sped away, tires screeching as it disappeared down the street. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice commanding. "Duke, hold!" The dog obeyed, his growls softening but his stance unwavering. He kept the man pinned, his teeth mere inches from the man's throat. "You don't understand," the man stammered, his arrogance now replaced by sheer terror. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We just—" Eleanor cut him off, her tone sharp and merciless. "You just thought you could rob an old woman because you assumed no one would care? You thought no one would stop you?" She shook her head, her eyes piercing. "You're going to regret every choice you made today." Red and blue lights washed over the street as a police cruiser rolled to a stop. Officer James Carter stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Mrs. Davis," he called out, his voice steady. "Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, her hand firm on Duke's leash. "We're fine, Officer Carter. My Duke here made sure of that." The officer's gaze shifted to the man trapped beneath Duke. "I see that," he said grimly. "Good work, Duke." He crouched slightly, his voice firm. "Stay still, buddy. Don't make this worse for yourself." The man whimpered. "Get this dog off me." Eleanor didn't budge. "Not until you're cuffed and in the back of that car." Officer Carter moved swiftly, securing the man's hands behind his back. "Okay, Mrs. Davis. You can call him off now." "Duke!" "Release," Eleanor commanded. The Rottweiler stepped back instantly, his posture alert as he returned to her side. Eleanor knelt, running her hand over Duke's head. "Good boy," she murmured. "You did so well." The man groaned as Officer Carter hauled him to his feet. "Where are your friends?" Carter demanded. The man's gaze dropped to the pavement. "They left me," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Smart of them," Carter said dryly, before glancing at Eleanor. "We'll handle it from here. Are you sure you're okay?" Eleanor stood tall, her hand resting on Duke's head. "We're okay now, but I want to make sure this doesn't happen again." "It won't," Carter promised, leading the man to the cruiser. As the red and blue lights faded into the distance, Eleanor looked down at Duke, her protector and partner. Together, they had faced hatred and emerged unbroken, and together they would ensure justice prevailed. What happens when a woman's quiet strength and unwavering resolve face off against arrogance and prejudice? The aftermath of Eleanor Davis's confrontation with hatred reveals a deeper battle for justice and dignity. Let's explore the moments that followed this harrowing ordeal. The steel door slammed shut behind Officer Carter as Eleanor let out a controlled exhale. Though the adrenaline had subsided, her resolve remained unshaken. Duke leaned into her side, his tail wagging gently as if sensing her victory. She gave him a small, grateful smile. "Let's go home, boy," she murmured, leading him back toward the solace of their house. Standing on the sidewalk outside her home, Eleanor watched the last police cruiser drive away. The street returned to its serene suburban quiet, but the weight of what had transpired lingered heavily in the air. Duke sat by her feet, his ears alert, as he scanned the surroundings for any lingering threats. She reached down to pat his head, drawing comfort from his steady presence. Yet her thoughts swirled, replaying the confrontation and the hateful words the men had hurled at her. Their venom fueled her determination. This wasn't over. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. Pulling it from her pocket, she saw Officer Carter's name on the screen. His voice was steady as he greeted her. "Mrs. Davis, I wanted to let you know we've got the man your dog stopped in custody. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement." Eleanor straightened, her voice firm and unwavering. "Of course. I want to see this through." Arriving at the police station a short while later, Eleanor was greeted by a bustling atmosphere. Though Duke stayed home to rest after his heroic efforts, his protective energy felt like a steadying force within her. Officer Carter met her at the front desk and guided her through a corridor to a small interview room. "Thanks for coming in," Carter said, gesturing to a chair as he placed a clipboard on the table. "We've got Brian Tanner in holding." The man Duke stopped. "He's not being very cooperative, but I thought you might want to say a few words before we take your statement." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're saying I can talk to him?" Carter nodded. "Within reason. Sometimes hearing from the victim can make an impact. Don't worry. I'll be right there." After a brief pause, Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Take me to him." A guard escorted Eleanor into the holding area. The steel door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with a table and 2 chairs. Brian Tanner slouched in one of them, his arm in a hastily bandaged sling. The bravado he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by irritation and unease. Eleanor stepped into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her gaze locked onto Brian's, calm but unyielding. "Brian Tanner," she said, her voice steady. "So that's your name?" Brian leaned back, attempting a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "What's it to you, lady?" Eleanor took the seat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "You and your friends decided to attack me in broad daylight. I think I have the right to know who thought they could get away with it." Brian scoffed, his smirk fading slightly. "Attack? We didn't attack you. We just wanted what you had. You didn't have to make it such a big deal." "A big deal?" Eleanor's voice sharpened, and she leaned forward. "You stalked me, threatened me, and tried to rob me. That dog of mine saved you from a worse fate. If you had gotten what you wanted, would it have stopped there?" Brian's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Eleanor pressed on, her tone cutting. "You thought no one would care, didn't you? You thought I'd be easy prey, because I'm old and black, and you assumed no one would stand up for me. Isn't that right?" Brian's smirk disappeared entirely. He looked away, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. "I don't have to listen to this," he muttered. "No, you don't," Eleanor replied, leaning back. "But you'll listen to the judge when this goes to trial. The security camera caught everything. There's no hiding from what you and your friends did." Brian shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders slumping. "They ran," he said bitterly. "They left me there. Cowards." "They are," Eleanor said bluntly. "But you followed them. You made that choice. Now, you get to live with the consequences." Brian shot her a glare, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Eleanor replied evenly. "I know you thought you were untouchable. I know you thought you could intimidate me. But let me tell you something, Mr. Tanner. You've got nothing I'm afraid of." Before Brian could retort, the door opened, and Officer Carter stepped inside. "That's enough," he said, nodding toward Eleanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. I think we've got what we need." Eleanor stood, her gaze lingering on Brian for a moment longer. "You should start thinking about how you got here, Mr. Tanner, because this is just the beginning of your reckoning." Her footsteps echoed down the corridor as she left the room. Back in the interview area, she sat with Carter to complete her statement, her mind unwavering. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready to see it through. The following morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The events of the day before lingered vividly in her mind, but she felt a sense of calm resolve. Duke lay at her feet, occasionally glancing up as if sensing her lingering tension. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she answered it, recognizing Carter's voice on the other end. "Good morning, Mrs. Davis," he greeted. "I thought you'd like to know. 2 more of the men from yesterday have been arrested." Eleanor exhaled slowly, gripping her coffee cup a little tighter. "Good," she said firmly. "Let's make sure they face justice." Eleanor tightened her grip on the phone, her voice steady yet sharp. "That's good to hear, Officer Carter. Where did you find them?" "Not far," Carter replied. "One of them was hiding at a relative's house. The other was out in the open, pretending like nothing happened. Once we put out the warrants, it didn't take long. Tanner's cooperation, or lack thereof, didn't matter much after we pulled the security footage. The video gave us everything we needed to identify them." Eleanor's lips pressed into a firm line. "And the driver? What about him?" "We're closing in," Carter assured her. It's only a matter of time. Once we have him, the DA's office will move forward with all charges. Setting her coffee cup down, Eleanor stared out her window at the calm, quiet street. The contrast between its tranquility and the chaos she had faced days earlier was stark. "Good," she said, her voice firm. "They need to be held accountable for what they did. They will," Carter promised. Then his tone shifted slightly. "But I wanted to give you a heads up about something else. The arrests are making waves. Local media picked up the story. And, well, it's already sparking reactions." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "What kind of reactions?" "Mostly supportive," Carter replied carefully. "But, as you might expect, some people are spinning it, saying it's not as bad as it looks, or that the men didn't mean any harm. The usual excuses." Eleanor's jaw tightened, her resolve hardening. "Let them talk," she said firmly. "The truth is on our side." Later that afternoon, Eleanor wandered the aisles of her local grocery store. As she moved through the familiar space, she couldn't help but notice the glances, some curious, others sympathetic, and a few brimming with barely concealed judgment. In the produce section, a woman she recognized from the neighborhood approached her. "Eleanor, I heard about what happened," the woman said, her voice hushed but urgent. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone polite but restrained. "Duke and I handled it." The woman nodded, though her expression faltered. "It's just such a shame, isn't it? Young men these days, they just don't think." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, her polite veneer cracking. "No," she said firmly, "they don't. But this wasn't about a lack of thought. They knew exactly what they were doing." The woman flinched at Eleanor's sharp tone, but quickly recovered, forcing a tight smile before making her excuses and hurrying away. Eleanor watched her retreat with a mix of frustration and determination swirling inside her. That evening, Eleanor sat in her living room, the warm glow of a lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. She flipped through channels until the local news caught her eye. On the screen, a reporter stood in front of the police station, her expression somber. "The arrests of 2 additional suspects today bring the total to 3, the reporter announced. "The men are accused of attempting to rob Mrs. Eleanor Davis, a retired teacher, during her afternoon walk. The confrontation, partially captured on a neighbor's security camera, has ignited both outrage and debate within the community." The screen shifted to the grainy footage from the security camera, showing the group of men closing in on Eleanor. Duke's fierce intervention played out in stark detail, drawing a faint, fleeting smile from Eleanor. But as the reporter continued, her smile faded. "While many have expressed support for Mrs. Davis, some have questioned the severity of the charges, claiming the suspects were misguided and that the situation escalated unnecessarily." Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "Misguided?" she muttered, her frustration bubbling over. "They attacked me in broad daylight, and they call that misguided?" The next segment featured community interviews. A young woman spoke passionately, her voice brimming with conviction. "What happened to Mrs. Davis was unacceptable. No one should feel unsafe walking in their own neighborhood." But then came the skeptical voice of a middle-aged man. "I mean, yeah, they shouldn't have done it, but people are acting like these guys are hardened criminals. It's not like they hurt anyone." Eleanor switched off the television, her frustration boiling over. She stood and began pacing the room, her thoughts racing. The audacity of people excusing such blatant violence infuriated her. She had defended herself and her loyal companion, yet now she had to contend with people diminishing her experience. Duke sat up, watching her with calm, attentive eyes. She knelt beside him, stroking his sleek fur. "They think they can talk their way out of this, boy," she said softly, "but they're wrong. They picked the wrong woman to mess with." The phone rang again, breaking the silence. Eleanor answered, her tone brisk. "Hello, Mrs. Davis. This is Jessica Nguyen," a steady, professional voice said. "I've been assigned as the prosecutor for your case." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you for calling, Ms. Nguyen. I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." "Trust me, it won't," Jessica replied confidently. "The evidence is strong, and we're pursuing the maximum penalties. I'll keep you updated as we prepare for the arraignment." Eleanor nodded, a small but determined smile forming. "Good, I'll be ready." As she hung up, she leaned back in her chair, Duke curling up at her feet. The fight for justice wasn't over, but Eleanor knew she had the strength to see it through. The tension in the room was palpable as Michael Mick Lewis sat across from Eleanor Davis, his eyes darting nervously, avoiding her piercing gaze. His thin frame seemed to shrink further under the weight of the moment. Jessica Nguyen sat beside Eleanor, her calm yet commanding presence filling the space. The two women exuded a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with Mick's visible discomfort. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. "Why were you in the park, Mick? So close to where everything happened?" Mick swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to Jessica as if seeking refuge. "I wasn't hiding," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know where else to go." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "You didn't know where else to go? Or you were hoping to avoid capture? Which is it, Mick?" Mick shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his cuffed hands twitching slightly. "Look," he started, his voice cracking. "It wasn't my idea. Tanner planned everything. I was just the driver. That's all." Eleanor's voice cut through his excuses like a knife. "You drove them there. You waited while they stalked me, and you planned to drive them away after they robbed me. That makes you just as guilty." Mick flinched at her words, his head hanging lower. "I didn't think it'd go that far," he said, his tone defensive. "Tanner said it'd be quick, easy. I didn't know he'd—" "Didn't know he'd what?" Jessica interjected sharply, her pen poised over a notepad. Mick hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't know he'd threaten her like that. I didn't sign up for that kind of thing." "You didn't sign up for it," Eleanor repeated, her tone icy. "But you didn't stop it, either. You sat there, ready to speed off with the things you thought you'd take from me." The room fell silent for a moment, Mick's shallow breaths the only sound. Jessica broke the tension. "Mick, let's be clear. Your involvement makes you complicit. What you didn't do is as important as what you did." Mick's shoulders sagged further, his voice barely a whisper. "I just needed the money." Eleanor straightened, her expression unyielding. "And you thought you could take it from me? You thought no one would care about an old lady? Let me tell you, Mick, you underestimated me. And my dog. That's your first mistake." Jessica exchanged a glance with Eleanor before addressing Mick again. "Here's the situation. We have overwhelming evidence against you. The security footage, Eleanor's testimony, and your apprehension in the park all point to your guilt. If you want any leniency, now's the time to be honest. Why were you still in this area? What were you planning?" Mick hesitated again, his hands clenching briefly. "I wasn't planning anything," he said weakly. "I didn't know what to do after the others ran. I figured if I stayed low, no one would look for me." Jessica's pen paused mid-note. "Staying low in a public park, Mick? That doesn't sound like much of a plan." Eleanor's voice carried a sharp edge. "Were you watching me? Hoping for another chance?" Mick's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. "No, I swear, no! I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't even want to be there that day." "Yet there you were," Eleanor replied, her voice cold and steady. Jessica stood, gathering her files. "That's enough for now. Mick, your actions and excuses will be presented in court. If there's more you want to share, you'd better think carefully. This is your chance." Mick looked down, defeated, as he was escorted out of the room. Jessica turned to Eleanor, her expression softening slightly. "You did well. Every word you said will carry weight in court. He's crumbling under the pressure, but it won't change what he did." Eleanor exhaled, her tension easing slightly. "I want them all to face justice, Jessica. They need to know they can't prey on people like me." "They will," Jessica assured her. "With your testimony and the evidence we have, there's little room for doubt. Justice will be served." Eleanor nodded, standing tall as she prepared to leave. Duke rose to his feet, wagging his tail gently as he followed her out. The fight wasn't over, but Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced hatred and fear head-on, and with every step, she moved closer to the justice she sought, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. As the cool evening air greeted her outside the station, Eleanor looked down at Duke and smiled. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "We've got work to do." The courtroom was silent, every ear attuned to Eleanor Davis's measured voice. She sat upright in the witness stand, her hands clasped together as she recounted the harrowing details of that fateful day. Her gaze swept across the jury, unwavering and filled with conviction. "When they surrounded me," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "it wasn't just about taking my necklace. It was about power, about them trying to strip me of my dignity and make me feel small. But I wasn't going to let them have that." Jessica Nguyen nodded, her expression firm as she guided Eleanor through her testimony. "And when Duke intervened, what was your immediate thought?" Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, her voice softening for a moment. "Relief. I knew Duke wouldn't let them hurt me. He's always been by my side. And that day, he proved just how far he'd go to protect me." Jessica allowed the moment to linger before continuing. "Mrs. Davis, did any of the defendants show remorse during the incident?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "No, they were confident, almost arrogant. Even when Duke growled, they thought they could overpower him. And me. It wasn't until Duke took action that they started to realize they had made a mistake." The prosecutor turned to the jury, her voice clear and deliberate. "What you've heard today is the story of a woman who refused to be a victim. Mrs. Davis's courage and her dog's loyalty turned what could have been a tragedy into a testament of resilience. Let the evidence show that these men acted with malicious intent, targeting her because they believed she was vulnerable." When Jessica returned to her seat, Eleanor exhaled slowly, her testimony complete. The defense attorney rose next, his tone measured yet subtly dismissive. "Mrs. Davis," he began, "you've described the events as terrifying and dangerous, but isn't it true that no one physically harmed you during this encounter?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "No one harmed me physically because Duke stopped them. If he hadn't been there, I'm not sure I'd be sitting here today." The attorney adjusted his tie, shifting strategies. "And this dog of yours, a Rottweiler, isn't it possible he overreacted, perhaps escalating the situation?" Eleanor's calm demeanor didn't falter. "Duke didn't overreact. He protected me. He only acted when they threatened me. If they had walked away when I told them to, none of this would have happened." The defense attorney attempted to push further, but Eleanor's clarity and poise left little room for doubt. Each question was met with a firm, concise response that reinforced the men's guilt. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented the security footage, a chilling yet clear account of the events. The video showed the men taunting Eleanor, their predatory behavior unmistakable. It captured Duke's decisive actions, his loyalty and bravery on full display. The jury's expressions shifted from shock to determination as they absorbed the undeniable evidence. When it came time for the defendants to testify, their stories were riddled with contradictions. Brian Tanner tried to paint himself as the mastermind, but downplayed the intent, claiming it was just a prank that got out of hand. The others followed suit, pointing fingers at one another, their camaraderie dissolving under the weight of scrutiny. Michael "Mick" Lewis, visibly shaken, admitted his role but placed blame squarely on Tanner. He said no one would care about her. "That's why we targeted her." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the admission hitting like a lightning bolt. In her closing arguments, Jessica Nguyen stood tall, her voice ringing with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about more than just robbery. It's about accountability. These men believed they could intimidate and harm someone they thought was defenseless. They underestimated Mrs. Davis, her courage, and her dog's unwavering loyalty. Their actions were calculated, and their intent was clear. Now, it's up to you to deliver justice." The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the case evident in their expressions as they returned to the courtroom. Eleanor sat in silence, her heart steady, but her hands resting on her lap, fingers intertwined. Duke wasn't with her, but she felt his presence, his strength in every breath she took. The foreperson stood, the verdict in hand. We, the jury, Find the defendants guilty on all counts." A collective exhale rippled through the room. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of relief washing over her. Justice had prevailed. Later that evening, Eleanor sat on her porch with Duke, the stars twinkling above them. She stroked his fur, her voice soft but resolute. "It's over, boy. We did it." Duke wagged his tail, his loyalty unwavering. The fight had been long and arduous, but Eleanor had proven that strength comes in many forms. Together, she and Duke had stood against hatred, and together they had emerged victorious. Brian Tanner's face blanched as Judge Anita Reynolds delivered her sentence. His once smug demeanor evaporated entirely, replaced by a mask of disbelief and quiet dread. Eleanor sat still, her gaze unwavering as she watched justice unfold. This moment was not just about punishment. It was a statement against the entitlement and malice that had driven the defendant's actions. The judge continued, her voice calm yet resolute. "James Foley and Kyle Mercer, while you may not have been the instigators, your participation in this crime makes you equally accountable. Your willingness to intimidate and threaten an innocent woman demonstrates a complete disregard for the law and basic human decency. You are each sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. Foley and Mercer exchanged nervous glances, their heads hanging as the weight of their sentences settled in. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, punctuated by gasps from a few spectators. Finally, Judge Reynolds turned her attention to Michael "Mick" Lewis. "Mr. Lewis, your cooperation with the prosecution has been noted, and the court recognizes your efforts to provide truthful testimony. However, this does not absolve you of your involvement in this crime. By driving the vehicle and remaining at the scene, you facilitated the actions of your co-defendants. You are sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3 years. Mick nodded weakly, his shoulders slumping further. While his sentence was lighter, the consequences of his choices were now unavoidable. The judge looked toward Eleanor, her gaze softening slightly. "Mrs. Davis, on behalf of this court, I extend my gratitude for your courage and composure throughout this trial. Your actions and testimony have ensured that justice is served." Eleanor inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." The gavel came down with a decisive crack. "This court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor remained seated for a moment, taking it all in. Jessica Nguyen approached, a satisfied smile on her face. "It's over, Eleanor. You did it." Eleanor nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "No, Jessica, we did it. You presented the case beautifully. I'm grateful." Jessica placed a reassuring hand on Eleanor's arm. "You were the heart of this case. Your strength and Duke's loyalty carried this through. Now, you can move forward, knowing they won't hurt anyone else." Later that evening, Eleanor sat on her porch with Duke at her side. The stars sparkled brightly above, the air crisp and fresh. She sipped tea from a ceramic mug, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. "You know, Duke," she said, glancing at the loyal dog who wagged his tail in response, "they thought no one would care. They thought I'd just roll over and let them take what they wanted. But they were wrong." Duke nuzzled her hand, his presence grounding her. Eleanor smiled, a small but victorious curve of her lips. "We showed them, boy. We showed them that strength isn't about size or age. It's about heart. And you've got more heart than anyone I know." As she leaned back in her chair, her gaze lifted toward the stars. The battle had been long, but justice had prevailed. For the first time since that fateful day, Eleanor felt peace, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. The world may not have cared in the eyes of her attackers, but Eleanor had proven them wrong. She had fought back, and with Duke by her side, she had ensured they'd never forget it. Duke pounced on the new toy with boundless enthusiasm, his strong jaws tugging and pulling at the sturdy rope. Eleanor chuckled softly, the sound easing some of the tension that still lingered in her chest. Watching him play, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Duke's unwavering loyalty, but for the small moments of peace they had carved. out of such chaos. The soft hum of the evening wrapped around her like a blanket as she settled back into her chair. The glow of the streetlights outside gave the neighborhood a tranquil appearance, masking the turmoil that had once erupted there. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. Her mind wandered to the trial's closing moments, the judge's gavel echoing in her memory. The sentences had been harsh, but they were fair. A clear message that actions born of malice and entitlement would not go unpunished. Brian Tanner's fleeting glance, filled with anger and regret, played in her mind. She had met his gaze with strength, refusing to let his resentment diminish her victory. Duke's tail thumped against the floor, pulling her back to the present. He carried the rope toy in his mouth, presenting it to her as if asking her to join the game. Eleanor smiled, taking the other end of the toy and giving it a playful tug. "You never quit, do you, boy?" she said, her tone light with affection. Duke growled playfully, his strong grip unwavering as he pulled against her. For a few minutes, the world outside melted away, replaced by the simple joy of their game. When Duke finally let go, he sat at her feet, panting happily. Eleanor leaned down, scratching behind his ears. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I've faced a lot in my life. But what happened with those men? It reminded me of something important. People like Tanner think they can take what they want, because no one will stand up to them. But they're wrong. We stood up, didn't we? And we showed them." Duke nuzzled her hand in response, his warm, steady presence a balm to her soul. Eleanor's gaze turned back to the street outside. It was the same road she had walked so many times, the place where her peaceful routine had been shattered. Yet, as she looked at it now, it felt different, stronger, safer. She thought about the neighbors who had gathered outside the courthouse, some offering words of support while others struggled with their own discomfort. Their reactions had been varied, but Eleanor knew one thing for certain. Her actions had made an impact. The trial wasn't just about her. It was about challenging the prejudice and entitlement that had emboldened those men. As the hours passed, the tension of the day slowly ebbed away. Duke eventually curled up at her feet, his breathing slow and even as he drifted to sleep. Eleanor stayed awake a little longer, her thoughts returning to the journey they had taken together. The attack had been terrifying, a stark reminder of the ugliness that still existed in the world. But it had also revealed something deeper, a well of strength she hadn't realized she possessed. With Duke by her side, she had faced hatred and violence head-on, refusing to back down even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Her testimony in the courtroom had been more than just a recounting of events. It had been a declaration, a statement that she and others like her mattered, that their lives and dignity were worth defending. And the jury's verdict was proof that the world could recognize that, even if it took a fight. As the night deepened, Eleanor rose from her chair and moved toward her bedroom. Duke stirred, following her with the quiet devotion he always showed. She turned off the lights, leaving the room in darkness except for the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. "Good night, Duke," she murmured as she climbed into bed. Duke settled at the foot of the bed, his presence a comforting reminder that she was never alone. Eleanor closed her eyes, her thoughts quieting as sleep began to take her. The fight for justice had been long and grueling, but it was over now, and as she drifted into dreams, she carried with her the knowledge that she had faced the worst and emerged stronger. She and Duke had stood together, and together they had won. Duke settled into his favorite spot by the couch, his new toy securely between his paws, while Eleanor sank into her chair, letting out a long, contented sigh. The soft hum of the evening filled the room, a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured just weeks before. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to absorb the peace that now enveloped her home, a peace hard-won and deeply cherished. The quiet of the night carried a kind of finality, a sense of having closed one chapter and opened another. Eleanor's thoughts lingered on the trial, the moments in the courtroom where she had stood firm, recounting her story with unwavering clarity. She had faced down prejudice, malice, and fear, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been dismissed or underestimated. Her gaze shifted to Duke, now dozing lightly, the occasional thump of his tail betraying dreams of play and triumph. "You're my hero," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, reaching for the book resting on the side table. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt no rush, no urgency, just the calm reassurance of knowing they were safe. As the hours passed, the room grew quieter still. Eleanor put the book aside, her thoughts drifting back to the words she had spoken earlier. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with small steps. Those words weren't just for the courtroom. They were for herself, her community, and the world she believed in. She glanced toward the window, the street outside bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. The same street where the confrontation had unfolded now felt different, transformed by her determination and courage. The fear and uncertainty that had once hung over it had given way to hope and strength. As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor stood and stretched, her movements deliberate but unhurried. "Come on, Duke," she called softly, and the dog's ears perked up. He rose from his spot, his new toy clutched proudly in his mouth. Together, they moved through the house, turning off the lights one by one. In the quiet stillness of her bedroom, Eleanor knelt down to rub Duke's ears one last time before climbing into bed. "We're going to be just fine," she whispered. Duke wagged his tail, curling up at the foot of the bed, his presence a comforting constant. Eleanor lay back, staring at the ceiling, her heart light. The battle was over, but the journey wasn't. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, new opportunities to stand tall. But for now, she allowed herself to rest, knowing she had done her part to make the world a little brighter, a little safer, for herself, for Duke, and for others who needed to see that courage could triumph over fear. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had reclaimed their peace. The promise of a brighter tomorrow stretched out before them, and Eleanor knew they would embrace it, one step at a time.